On December 4th, 1963, 12 days after President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, Malcolm X delivered a speech entitled "God's Judgment on White America," a speech which became famous not because of its content, but what he said afterward. The press asked Malcolm to comment on the assassination of President Kennedy, and he said that the president's death was a case of chickens coming home to roost. The media had a field day and distorted Malcolm's words to make it seem as if he was glad the president had been shot. The circus that ensued led Malcolm to be silenced by Elijah Muhammad for 90 days, causing him to eventually break with the Nation of Islam and ultimately to be assassinated by the FBI with help from the nation. Before his death, Malcolm said the press had manipulated his words on that day. He never said he was glad the president had been shot, but that the president's assassination was a result of the climate of hate in America, and how the culture of violence that pervaded American society had contributed to the president's death. The nation's sins had come back to bite it. He used the metaphor of chickens coming home to roost to powerfully convey how our violent tendencies and oppressive policies had horrific consequences for everyone. The violence and racism America had inflicted on people of color throughout its history and exported to other places in the world had now come back to haunt us. And his remarks were seen at the time to be incredibly controversial, mostly because he placed blame for the assassination of Kennedy on American society itself, rather than on the individual shooter, highlighting in that time how structural racism, a climate of hate, and a culture of violence had created the conditions for such a tragic event to occur. He was ultimately saying, the shooter has been apprehended, but the killer is still at large. There have been at least 44 attempts to assassinate the President of the United States. 7 American presidents have been shot and 4 have been killed. Our nation's history is filled with political assassinations, from elected leaders like Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and both Kennedys, to civil rights leaders like Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Hampton, John Lennon, and Harvey Milk, just to name a few. The attempted assassination on Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania last Saturday was most certainly a tragic event, but it was not unprecedented in American history, nor was it all that surprising. What is surprising in this specific instance are the shooter's motives, or should I say lack thereof. Princeton historian James Clark, a scholar of presidential assassinations, claims that most assassins who've attempted to kill the president have been politically motivated, hoping to change the direction of the government. However, that does not seem to be the case here with 20-year-old Thomas Crooks, a disaffected and politically ambiguous young white man who was bullied in school, with easy access to semi-automatic weapons and materials for bombs, yet did not leave behind any sort of political manifesto that has been found at this time. In fact, as far as we know it, this may be the least politically motivated assassination attempt on an American president in history. Even John Hinckley was more politically motivated when he shot President Reagan to try to get a date with Jodie Foster. However, if you've listened afterwards to the way that the media and our political leaders on both sides of the aisle have responded to this assassination attempt, you'd imagine that Crooks was the most politically motivated assassin our country has ever seen in its history. Americans of all sides swiftly coalesced around the language of political violence, rather than domestic terrorism, for instance, to describe this particular event. In a speech immediately following the shooting, President Biden said, "The idea that there's political violence in America like this is just unheard of." Well, not really. But continuing on, he said, it's just not appropriate. Look, he says, there's no place in America for this kind of violence. It's sick, he said. Everybody must condemn it. Everybody. And condemn it, almost everyone did. Political violence is absolutely unacceptable, wrote Bernie Sanders. There is absolutely no place for political violence in our democracy, tweeted Barack Obama. There is no place for political violence here, wrote Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And then, joining the chorus of Democratic politicians was Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Israel Katz, who tweeted, "Violence can never be a part of politics." Hypocritical, given he's overseen the death of over 150,000 Palestinians. So this caused me to ask, what is political violence? Why are leaders on both sides, both parties, coalescing around this phrase? What does it mean? How is it different from other kinds of violence that we have around us? If you look up the definition of political violence, you'll find it refers quite simplistically to violence that is politically motivated or perpetrated to achieve a political end or political goals. However, as I said, as far as we know it, Thomas Crooks was not politically motivated. In fact, he'd recently searched for the public appearances of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, as well as Attorney General Merrick Garland, FBI Director Christopher Wray, as well as members of the British royal family. The reason Trump was chosen seems to be the convenience of this rally that was only 40 miles from Crooks' home. So why have all of our leaders, then, been so quick to condemn it as political violence, if the assassination attempt, as far as we know, was not at all politically motivated? What's going on? There is one sad but simple answer. It could be the only kind of violence that all American politicians oppose is not political violence as such, but violence against American politicians. The bipartisan condemnation of political violence reeks of self-interest and hypocrisy. As soon as the bullets started flying, every political leader in America instantly became a staunch pacifist. Suddenly, a fierce advocate of nonviolence once before had no problem with violence. It was odd, because I'd never heard many of them say anything about peace after a mass shooting. Out of nowhere, politicians with the most harmful policies and violent rhetoric were suddenly preaching peace to those far and near. All at once, there was a new kind of violence called political violence that we were all required to agree was now the worst kind of violence in America. It has no place in American society, that must be condemned by everyone. But I want to stop for a minute. What about all the other kinds of violence? Are there certain kinds of violence that do have a place in America? Do we condemn all violence or only violence directed at American political leaders? This hyper-focus on political violence, or should I say violence against politicians, can have a dangerous effect of narrowing our definition of what violence is, which is a serious problem, because the narrower our definition of violence, the narrower our vision of peace. The narrower our definition of violence, the narrower our vision of peace. When I heard our political leaders suddenly preaching peace, I could not help but think of the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the way they described the false preachers of their day. They said, "From least to greatest, all practice deceit. They dress up the wound of my people as if it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." When politicians condemn violence, it seems as if they often only mean the violence that comes from the bottom up, and never the violence that comes from the top down, which is the backbone of the system. A protest is considered nonviolent so long as there is no property damage. But what about the violence the people were protesting in the first place? There has always been a way of preaching peace that is shallow and disingenuous, a way of preaching peace that is the simplistic absence of an activity that the powerful do not like. But peace is not just a negative concept, as in the absence of war or conflict or political violence. Peace is a positive and constructive ethic. It is a way of life that is synonymous with the way of Jesus. We know this because peace on earth is what the angels sang when the Prince of Peace was born in Bethlehem. And in his first sermon, Jesus proclaimed, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." And the very first word the risen Jesus uttered to his disciples was peace, not simply as a greeting, but because the good news of resurrection was a call to embody a life of peace. In his letter to the Ephesians and the churches in the Lycus River Valley in Asia Minor, Paul explained that Jesus came preaching peace, and through his death created peace between those who were near and those who were far, between Jews and Gentiles, circumcised and uncircumcised, citizens and strangers, saints and aliens. In the average Jewish mind in the first century, the world was divided into two camps, between Israel, Jewish people, and everybody else, which means that Paul here, as a Jewish scholar, was saying Jesus had brought peace to the entire world. He claimed that the person and work, the life and teachings, the death and preaching, every other aspect of who Jesus is and what Jesus did for us can and should be summarized by one word: peace. Paul's message of peace was radically countercultural, because Paul was not the only one that time preaching peace. There was another story about peace going around those days, and just like today, there were people constantly preaching about it. Every church that Paul wrote to in the Lycus River Valley was ruled by the Roman Empire. And one of the primary themes of imperial propaganda was that Caesar had restored order. Caesar had established unity, and that Caesar had brought peace to the entire world. It was inscribed everywhere across the Roman Empire, on buildings, on monuments, on altars of peace. Imperial historians like Virgil and Horace called it the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that we all learned about in Western Civ class, where it was described as that golden age of Rome, a 200-year period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, spanning the entirety of the Middle East, from England all the way to Morocco, ushered in by the great Caesar Augustus, the Pax Romana. People believed that this peace of Rome was a divine miracle that Caesar had brought to the world. Paterculus preached, "There is no boon that humans can desire of the gods, no conceivable wish or blessing which Augustus did not already bestow upon the Republic, the Roman world, including the establishment of peace." Ovid preached, "Caesar is a man of peace." Strabo preached, "The Romans and their allies have never enjoyed such peace and prosperity as provided by Caesar." Rome's imperial propagandists were constantly preaching about the peace of Caesar and the peace of Rome, but in reality, the Pax Romana was not peaceful for anyone but Caesar and the Roman elite. One historian wrote, "The volume of the Cambridge Ancient History for the years 70 to 192 AD is called the Pax Romana, but peace is not what you will find in those pages." Even Rome's own historians critiqued the Pax Romana. Tacitus, for example, quoted a speech from the Scottish general Calgacus where he said, "These Romans are plunderers of the world. After exhausting the land by their devastating hands, they are rifling oceans. To plunder, butcher, and steal under false titles, these things they call empire. To make a desert, they call it peace." Any person living in Asia Minor in the first century world would have heard Paul's message about Jesus bringing peace and would have immediately thought of the widespread proclamations about the Pax Romana. Paul had taken all the phrases heaped upon Caesar for making peace and bringing peace to the world and then applied it to Jesus. But to proclaim that Jesus had brought peace was to proclaim that Caesar did not. And so it was an act of treason, what Paul was saying, an act of sedition, a disavowal of the Roman imperial propaganda. Paul was calling the churches in Asia Minor to turn away from the false peace of Caesar and the false peace of empire, and to cling to the true peace of Jesus and his message and his ministry. And embedded within Paul's cosmic contest between Christ and Caesar and these two contrasting visions of peace was an entirely new definition of violence. Caesar and the empire had promoted a narrow understanding of all violence as physical violence, the armed conflict between individuals, groups, and armies and nations, insisting that violence was not only necessary but a means to an end, that violence was the only way to achieve peace. But Paul confronted this narrow understanding of violence and its propaganda of peace with a broader definition of violence and a broader vision for peace. For Paul, violence was not just the use of physical force. For Paul, dehumanizing people was also violence. That's why he said, stop calling each other names. Stop calling each other circumcised or uncircumcised. Stop labeling each other strangers or citizens. Stop misnaming each other aliens or saints. Stop saying that those people have no hope and no God and no home. When we look closely at this passage, we can see that for Paul, dehumanizing people is violence. Excluding people is violence. Segregation is violence. Division is violence. And so are any laws, commandments, or ordinances that reinforce those things. They are also a form of violence. In this passage, we see that it is implied that superiority and supremacy of one group over another group is also a form of violence. Inequality and injustice are also violence. And for Paul, even hostility itself is a form of violence. For Paul, hate, enmity, and contempt for neighbor is already violence. Paul was telling his people that the reason the empire's vision of peace was so small is that their definition of violence was also so narrow. His words sound a lot like the great civil rights leader, Coretta Scott King, who once rose to speak on Juneteenth, 1968, at the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., in the wake of her husband's assassination, and said, "In this society, violence against poor people and minority groups is routine. I must remind you," she said, "that starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her family is violence. Discrimination against a worker is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical need is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence." And then she finished with this line, "Even the lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence." We must expand our definition of violence beyond the narrow confines of the empire and its preachers, so that we can begin to imagine a broader vision of peace, like the peace that Paul declared had come into the world in Jesus. For Paul, peace was not an abstract concept. It did not mean that everything was calm and copacetic, or that everyone was being nice to each other all the time. It was not an overly spiritualized feeling of tranquility. The peace Paul proclaimed was material and concrete, practical and earthly. It was about people coming together in peace and love. Peace is not a heavenly gift that drops out of the sky. Peace is something that we make, Paul said, something we create every day. And Paul called upon the life and teachings of Jesus to provide the churches in Asia Minor with a recipe and a roadmap for the things that make for peace. The famous anti-war poet Denise Levertov once found herself at a loss for words on a panel discussion in the 1980s. When a woman named Virginia Satter called upon her and other poets at the time to present to the world images of peace, not only war. Because, as Virginia said, everyone needs to be able to imagine peace if we're going to be able to achieve it. After years of reflecting on this moment where she was speechless, Levertov wrote that if a poetry of peace is ever to be written, there must first be the poetry of the preparation for peace. A poetry of protest, of lament, of praise for the living earth. A poetry that demands justice, renounces violence, and reveres mystery. She lays out the case for this preparation in her poem, Making Peace, where she writes, "A voice from the dark called out, 'The poets must give us imagination of peace, to oust the intense familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war.' But peace, like a poem," she writes, "is not there ahead of itself. It can't be imagined before it's made, can't be known except in the words of its making, grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid. A feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak them. A line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence of our lives, revoked its reaffirmation of profit and power, questioned our needs, allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum. Peace, a presence, an energy field more intense than war, might pulse then, stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living, of its words, each word, a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal." I love this poem, but we do not need to wait for the poets to imagine peace. All the ingredients for making peace are here in Paul's letter. Peace begins with radical inclusivity, the inclusion of those who were once excluded, actively welcoming them into the household of God, which means any attempt to radically exclude people from American democracy is an act of violence. Yet for radical inclusivity to take hold, Paul offers the second ingredient of equality, the elimination of superiority or supremacy. Welcoming and including people into beloved community, the household, and the commonwealth of God is important, but it is not enough on its own to create peace. Any form of supremacy that continues to exist within community destroys inclusivity, destroys peace, and is at war with the things that make for beloved community. Peace requires not only inclusivity, but equality and justice to become true. And then there's a third ingredient for peace, what Paul called reconciliation. But this is no kumbaya call for simply bringing people together at a church picnic, or naively saying, "Can't we all just get along?" You won't find that kind of sentimentality in Paul's letter. No, reconciliation, according to Paul, requires kicking down the walls that divide us. And literally, look at the word he uses, killing all the hostility that exists between us, putting hostility to death once and for all. These are not passive verbs that Paul was using here in the Greek. He was proclaiming that strong and courageous acts of resistance to the everyday forms of violence that pervade our lives is the true work of making peace and following Jesus. We live in a violent world. We live at a time when there are more guns than people in America. We live at a time when, like Thomas Crooks, you can legally buy an AR-15 before you can buy a drink. We live at a time when many are speaking out against political violence but are silent about all the other violence that besets our lives. We live at a time when many are out there preaching peace, but their vision of peace is far too small. As followers of Jesus, we cannot be content with the vision of peace that is being sold to us by the empire and its preachers. because we know that peace is larger than the absence of political violence. We are called to a broader vision of peace that is based on the active cultivation of a beloved community. We know that peace is something that must be made every day, regardless of how violent the world is around us. Yes, our chickens have come home to roost again. Our chickens. So the time has come for us to redouble our efforts to practice the things that make for peace. Remembering that inclusivity is what makes peace. Equality is what makes for peace. Reconciliation is what makes for peace. And justice is what makes for peace. Making peace will require us all to kick down the dividing walls between us and put hostility to death once and for all, and work as hard as we can to create a society where no one is ever called a stranger. No one is ever called an alien, but where everyone is fully embraced as a beloved child in the new humanity of God. Amen.